asked at the end. We will try and work them in as we go throughout. But with that said, I'd like to welcome Mike from the Rocky Mountain Institute and Richard from the American Gas Association.
Good afternoon.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
Fantastic. Afternoon.
Well, Josh, I'm happy to jump right in and get us started. Thanks for inviting me, and excited to be talking about this topic. It's very important. It's been in the news lately, and hope this will be fun. And I'm confident you'll hear a couple of different perspectives from me and from Richard. So hopefully through the course of discussion, we'll be able to really explore those in a meaningful way. So I'd like to tell you that there are many benefits to building, living, and working in buildings that use clean electricity for all their energy needs and are not burning natural gas in the building. They're not burning oil, not burning propane, not burning fossil fuels at all. And the policies like those we're seeing in cities moving to all electric new construction are an important step in that direction. They're also not the only policies. The term gas bans is in this session title. There are many other policies that are very important for moving us to a clean building sector. And as an example, I would point to the new building performance standard in St. Louis as one that's based on energy intensity in the buildings, and I think will move us in the same direction. But there's a wide range of policies out there. What we're seeing here in the picture is our RMI office up in the Rocky Mountains. This is a building in the coldest climate zone in the lower 48 with no gas inside of it. A modern building does not need fossil fuels to operate, to be comfortable. We don't need that gas burning in a furnace in the basement, in the kitchen to cook an omelet. We can be moving past having carbon monoxide detectors in our bedrooms. We can get past, wondering if what we're smelling might be a gas leak, and just move to a modern future without those fuels at all. And that transition is already underway. The gas, the all electric building policies that we see in California and Seattle, they are focused on new buildings, new construction, and this is a logical place to start. It's just cheaper to build it all electric in the first place than to try to retrofit it later. And it often can be cheaper to build all electric than to build with gas. And part of that is avoiding the infrastructure both to the building and upstream on the gas system that might burden us later. If you could go to my next slide. So we've got a massive gas system out there, and as we continue to build out all this infrastructure, if we envision a future that moves away from gas, then this is going to be a big stranded cost risk that these assets will be out there. They'll have more engineering life left than they have useful life in terms of the need to move gas through them. Also in new buildings, we see opportunities for high efficiency that allow us to minimize impacts on the electric grid from electric heating. We see opportunities to get the newest and best technologies in there, whether air source heat pumps, ground source heat pumps, induction cooking, et cetera, that can be built in from the start. And some of the arguments you'll hear in general against electrification, would have you think that the pro-electrification argument maybe is naive, or that we haven't done our homework, that it's just not realistic to move to an all-electric future. Maybe because we use the gas system for so much today, or because we add a new gas customer every minute around this country. To me, these are indicators of the scale of what needs to change, not indicators that because the system is large today that we need to stick with it indefinitely. Or because gas is cheap, that it's a cheap commodity, and the fracking boom in America has made the supply abundant. And I think, actually, if you'll go to my next slide, I do think there are some, there's another side to this, which is that the infrastructure spending on gas is going way up. We are seeing this concentrated in certain cities or states where investments in replacing old pipes are starting to come around. The city of Chicago is a good example, in the middle of a 30 or 40-year program to replace every gas main in the city. And those are, those are old. Some of those are over 100 years old. And at the same time, replacing them on that scale is driving big cost increases in that gas system. The other thing you might hear is that, gas just doesn't have that much emissions, that it's, the same as a couple weeks of coal use in China or Asia. And I want to say that it's, when we look at policies for climate change to get to zero carbon or to get to these 90% reductions, we need pretty massive reductions, including in the use of gas in the distribution system. So if you'll move to my next slide, there's other issues that play here too. So we put out this report about the health impacts. We know that burning gas produces nitrogen dioxide and other pollutants. We know that burning gas in a kitchen, when most people don't use ventilation, does cause increased risk of asthma and other health hazards. If you go to the next slide, and there are, technologies available to replace that. What we see here is, it shows you that the electric power sector has been reducing its emissions in this country. It's down about 1/3 since its peak in 2007. Buildings is mostly flat. I think you'll see similar in industry or transportation are mostly flat. And electricity is the only sector so far that's really cleaning up in this country. And it does create those opportunities to use that energy in other sectors. Next slide. And as we see more states, so this is from Colorado, what we see is states and cities starting to get very serious about climate action. People in elections are electing climate leaders, and those leaders are passing climate policies. And those include the city gas policies in California, but it's also much more around the country. And so what we've just seen in Colorado is the state has put out a greenhouse gas roadmap to reach its 90% reduction goals. And this is an indicator of what happens in the residential and commercial building sector with gas, is that the use needs to steeply decline. There is a role for biogas. It's modest. It makes up 5% of today's demand. And we end with no fossil gas in the system. So this, once states and cities are starting to do the math and say, how do we reduce emissions 80%, 90% or more, they're getting these kinds of results about what needs to happen in the gas system. Next slide. I want to say also that there's a lot of, this is a big transition from one system to another, and there are impacts on work. But there's a lot of work to be done in the transition, whether it is upgrading the electrical system, installing new HVAC, making buildings more efficient, and maintaining the gas system safely and reliably for as long as it needs to operate. And this picture here is from the all-electric IBEW building in Detroit. Next slide. And I also want to say that gas and electric and buildings is not as much a personal choice issue as you might think. This is a marketing picture from a new housing development in the town I live. My wife and I went down there to consider if we might want to relocate, and found that the gas issue was tough for us. I mean, it's a house built with gas appliances, and when we inquired with the sales manager about buying with electric instead, there really wasn't an option for us. They didn't have much to offer us. And the gas system, rather than being really an individual choice, is a publicly regulated system with a highly socialized cost structure. And when that new house is built, it's not necessarily the individual customer picking what they want. One more slide, please. And the last point I'll make is that we have made large transitions in how we heat buildings before. In 1940, coal was the dominant source of heating in this country in residential buildings. It took about 30 years to get it down below 5%, and about 40 years to get it to basically zero. And so this was a transition in which gas and oil largely took over from coal. And then we've seen this very steady, but gradual shift towards electricity over the last 30 or 40 years. And I want to say that with a push from policymakers, we can see the scale of transition once again to get to a carbon-free building sector by 2050. So I'll leave it there. I look forward to engaging in the discussion. Thank you.
Mike, thank you very much for your short presentation there. Richard?
Thanks, Josh, and happy to be. Can you hear me? I'm seeing a nod.
Absolutely, yes.
Great. And Mike, I think you've been following me on Twitter and taking a couple of my talking points and getting ahead of them. Let me start with the next slide, which is just AGA's introductory slide. I am the managing director of our Energy Markets Analysis and Standards group at AGA. Our job is to put the facts on the table about the role that natural gas and gas infrastructure can play to meet the goals of our clean energy economy. I think as we sift through this issue of electrification, of forced building electrification policies, of these gas bans issues, incentives, I think it's important to start with the facts, start with what is rather than what ought to be. So I'm going to start with what is and go through a few of those now. Next slide. Let's take a quick dive into the residential heating market. First and foremost, Mike, thank you. You noted that customers want gas. We add a new gas customer every minute in this country. Interestingly, where many of these electrification policies are popping up, Colorado, Massachusetts, Minnesota, other states, all show rates of gas addition well in excess of the national average. About 60 million households use natural gas today for their primary space heat. You can see the breakdown here for electric and for propane and fuel oil. Importantly, that the number of households across the US with heat, with electric heat, most of them are using low efficiency electric resistance. In fact, it's about twice the number of households that heat with heat pumps. If we look at the new construction market, that proportion has been shrinking over time, but still about 28% of new construction uses electric resistance as the primary source of space heating. That is a very inefficient way to go about things, a very costly way for customers. That's the left side of this chart. Let's look at the right side. We're talking about emissions. The primary goal here is to reduce emissions. That's the ostensible reason for these policies that we're talking about today. Residential natural gas consumption, which includes a share of methane emissions across the value chain, that's about 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions. In contrast, residential electricity today accounts for about 10%, and that also includes a share of methane since there's natural gas that supplies power for electricity. Mike helpfully noted the context of that 250 million metric tons, that 4% of residential gas consumption, that is equivalent to about 2 weeks of Chinese coal emissions. I'm not saying that makes these emissions unimportant, but it does put things into some perspective. And let's just move on from there. Next slide. The Department of Energy confirms the cost advantage of natural gas over other residential energy sources. Every year, the DOE publishes in the Federal Register an annual calculation of the average unit cost for residential energy. And here we see the cost for electricity, natural gas, number 2, heating oil, propane, and kerosene. You'll note that on an energy equivalent basis, the cost of electricity is about 4 times that of natural gas. In other words, if you're having a policy that creates an incentive or otherwise forces customers to go all electric, your whole household better be 4 times more efficient in terms of those electrical appliances compared to natural gas, or it's going to cost more to operate. And right now, the technical feasibility of that 400% or 4 times efficiency simply does not exist. Next slide. We can put those costs into practice. Each year, AGA puts out a winter heating outlook. We look across the whole market, and we just did that in October. One thing we did differently this year is we said, well, what happens to customers? And we looked at homes heating with natural gas versus electricity and made some assumptions around the efficiency of those appliances. And this winter, homes heating with natural gas can save between 46 and 71% compared to even the most efficient electrical alternatives. We also did some calculations on emissions, didn't put that on a slide here, but the average natural gas furnace is about 20% cleaner than an Energy Star rated electric air source heat pump and 50% cleaner than an electric resistance furnace. So it's cheaper to operate and today lower emissions. Next slide. You can click it. Yeah, there we go. Very importantly, the natural gas system delivers a tremendous scale of energy on days homes and businesses need it most. Actually, the natural gas delivery system delivers about 3 times more energy on the coldest day of the year than the electricity grid does on the hottest. And the size and the scale of the gas delivery system reflects the efficient nature of that system in delivering energy, as well as those decades of investment into infrastructure to safely meet those needs. And Mike noted, we have seen increases in investment precisely because of that expansion of the system. Customers want gas and improvements to the safety and reliability of the system. Let me put these numbers in a slightly different perspective. On January 30th, 2019, the US gas system delivered about 150 billion cubic feet of natural gas to homes and businesses. About 80 billion cubic feet of that 150 was served just to residential and commercial households. Let me put that 80 billion cubic feet into perspective. That's the equivalent energy to 24 terawatt hours of electrical energy, or roughly equivalent to what the entire US electric generation, the US electric grid can generate in terms of capacity over 24 hours. In other words, the amount of energy delivered just to the residential commercial sector to meet heating needs and other needs on that peak day is equivalent to what the entire electric generation grid could generate over 24 hours. Let's move to the next slide. I think no matter what policies we're talking about, the geographic context, there's a lot of considerations that we need to be thinking through. AGA's entry into this discussion around electrification began a few years ago, where we noted that many advocates looking to advance electrification as a strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions were proposing these strategies without a sufficient level of analysis commensurate with those policies. Let me say that that was 3 years ago. More work has been done since then, but at the core, there are some fundamental questions we need to be asking and answering as we evaluate the impacts of these policies. Notably, does the building electrification policy actually reduce greenhouse gas emissions? In some cases, yes. In many cases, maybe not. Will the building electrification policy impact gas utility customers? And what are those impacts? What are the effects on the power sector and on electric transmission and distribution infrastructure requirements? What's the overall cost of these policies? And how do those costs compare to other potential approaches to reducing greenhouse gas emissions? What happens to energy reliability and resilience? That's a key question that I think we're just starting to scratch the surface of, and needs to be more fully explored as we examine the impacts of these electrification policies. What are the effects of these forced electrification policies on the local economy, including jobs, wages, tax revenues? Just noted that it costs more in an all-electric scenario compared to one where you're using efficient gas. What are the knock-on economic effects there? We really need to understand those. And what are the distributional effects? Not all things are equal. We show you a lot of averages in these charts, but sometimes those that face a heavier energy burden would be burdened by the higher costs associated with energy and electrification policies. Let me move along here. I'll note that AGA produced a report in 2018 on the implications of policy-driven residential electrification. Next slide. A few key findings here. Let me start with the second bullet here. I noted that on the residential sector, about 4% of total greenhouse gas emissions every year. A widespread electrification policy that converts new and existing households to electricity by the year 2035 reduces overall emissions by about 1 to 1.5% of total GHGs. So, you have that 4% and you only get about 1 to 1.5% percentage points of that. The key insight here is that the potential emissions reductions from the residential sector are really partially offset by an increase in emissions from the power sector. So you're switching gas use in the residential sector to gas use in the power sector. And that's true even and especially in a case where all incremental generating capacity is met by renewable energy. We examined the costs of this electrification approach in terms of appliance costs, energy costs, so the difference in operating that equipment between electric or the other fuels, and then accounting for those infrastructure requirements. And we found that on average, about $1,000 to $1,500 per converted customer per year through that period. So significant costs associated with a widespread forced electrification policy. We note the overall cost of the transmission and generation capacity requirements. Let me say that we found this strategy as a greenhouse gas emissions strategy was very costly, upwards of $600 to $800 per metric ton of CO2 reduced, much higher than any carbon markets pricing today, and higher than the social cost of carbon estimates that are used in official rulemakings and so forth. Next slide. We also did some work at around the same time, suggesting that there are more thoughtful natural gas pathways to reducing emissions. I'll simply note that there are 100 plus rather, innovative new gas technologies that can improve efficiency, reduce the carbon intensity of supply to help meet our emissions reduction objectives. In the short term, we found that a 25 to 40% reduction in customer emissions associated with, or customer greenhouse gas emissions. And over the long term, significant advances in energy efficiency and the integration of renewable gases can achieve 80+% reduction in CO2 emissions. Next slide. To further build that case, in 2019, the American Gas Foundation put forward 2 studies to examine the opportunities for the direct use technologies for gas to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, looking at technologies like gas heat pumps to reduce emissions. And it also examined the potential, the resource potential for renewable natural gas. So gas derived from biogenic or even electricity, sources of electricity that can be integrated into the natural gas infrastructure, into the system to drive down emissions. And what we found is that the costs of those emissions reductions much lower than a widespread electrification approach. Last slide. Let me just note our climate change position statement. AGA is committed to reducing greenhouse gas emissions while maintaining reliable, resilient, affordable energy choices for customers, and that climate mitigation and adaptation actions should be constructed to recognize the potential benefits of gas and gas infrastructure to reduce emissions effectively and quickly while minimizing impacts to consumers and avoiding harm to the overall economy. Importantly, as companies continue to modernize our gas infrastructure and connect homes and businesses to the system, there are new opportunities that arise to achieve low-cost greenhouse gas emissions reductions by leveraging new technologies and our abundant gas resources and new renewable sources of gas. And additionally, we need to keep in mind that our gas infrastructure can be used for renewable energy storage and the delivery of renewable gases, including those from biogenic and zero carbon electricity. And really importantly, that the ability to leverage these or rather the gas system's ability to leverage these high value sources of renewable energy and like hydrogen, renewable gas, they're going to be critical components of our nation's ability to meet ambitious greenhouse gas reduction goals. I've said a lot, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with you, Josh, and with Mike here. So thank you all for the time today.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Mike. Both presentations, very detailed, significant amount of information. If it's all right with both of you, we do have some questions from the audience. If we can use those before going on to the other moderated section, great. So the first question was towards you, Richard, and that was, do the cost components that you shared, did they include health issues for asthma, other problems related to gas delivery? So externalities?
Let me address this issue because this report that Mike referenced from the Rocky Mountain Institute and published by others quite simply has a lot of unfounded claims in it. And many of the findings in that report on the health effects from gas stove pollution are not justified based on the report's supporting statements and the citations in that report. And the conclusions and recommendations in those reports are not sufficiently substantiated for making policy or for consumer decisions about energy choices. So I don't know how to answer that question without noting that the premise of that statement is unfortunately flawed.
Okay. There was a question about whether or not electric heat pumps work. This kind of to the same thing there, Mike, on your end there. Do electric heat pumps actually work adequately to heat buildings in winter weather areas?
Yeah, they do. Let me first just respond to Richard's point and say that I think it's, I mean, obviously we'll disagree here, but it's clear that, I mean, it's just chemistry that when gas combusts, it produces NO2. And we know that NO2 is a hazardous pollutant that's regulated by the EPA, and it does cause human health hazards, including asthma. And then there is empirical research indicating higher rates of asthma among children living in households exposed to that pollution from gas. But to respond to your question on heat pumps, yeah. So heat pumps definitely work in winter weather. You know, I live near Boulder, Colorado, and my house is 100% heat pump. And there's even, you know, buildings up higher in the mountains here that are operating on that. The advanced, you know, the most effective heat pump technology, the air source heat pump technology, will operate, you know, 10 below, 15 below, somewhere in that range, and can probably operate, you know, depending on how you size it, most of the way there without any kind of backup. And then you've got other technologies like ground source heat pumps that will operate basically at any temperature and are seeing healthy growth in the marketplace in New York and some markets like that experience very cold weather. And then even in other cases, like in, you know, northern Maine or Vermont, we see heat pumps going in and really growing substantially as an initial market in customers where they keep their existing system as backup. And so over the long term, we think, you know, we can get to a point where we don't need that, where the technologies are advanced and the homes are efficient enough not to need that backup. But, you know, even in an old house in northern Maine, there's a lot of opportunity to get those heat pumps in. And if on that one or 2 days where it's going to be 25 below, they've got a backup source they can still rely on. And then lastly, I guess, since this policy was about new buildings, it's, you know, you're just able to do so much more with new buildings, make them more efficient, make sure you use the most modern technologies, and you can really push it pretty far into cold temperatures.
Josh, I need to respond to something that was said here. First, let's talk about these claims around gas stoves, because we need to put a couple things to bed here. These are claims being made that are not supported by a data-driven investigation using science. And they're being used to drive an electrification agenda and create fear, uncertainty, and doubt with appliances that people love and are familiar with. And that is the deliberate strategy here. The fact of the matter is combustion emissions from gas ranges, ovens, cooktops can contribute to some degree to emissions of recognized pollutants, but there are no documented risks to respiratory health from gas stoves, and the regulatory advisory agencies that and organizations responsible for protecting residential consumer health and safety do not identify gas cooking as in this context. So I need to put that on the table just as a response. Let me now pivot to kind of the more technology side of things. On the heat pump front, Mike is exactly right. There's been a lot of advances in air source and ground source heat pump technologies. The simple fact of the matter is, especially with air source heat pumps, they stop working when you need them most. And we're talking about the coldest days of the year, where you need some sort of resistance backup, or even a gas backup, like a natural gas furnace backup, which actually might be a very efficient combination there, the upfront cost notwithstanding. So, let's be clear here that there are a lot of strategies and new technologies to drive further efficiency, drive down lower costs, and that can be on electricity or with emerging technologies like gas heat pumps. But there are still some real challenges with the heat pump technology, especially on the coldest days of the year, and meeting those end use needs for customers. And that has real implications in terms of cost, in terms of upstream, infrastructure requirements for, say, electricity to meet those end uses.
Thank you both very much. Richard, a question. The question about defining the difference between biogas and renewable natural gas?
Sure. Biogas is kind of a broadly defined, I don't know if there's a specific definition out there, but if you're producing, there's a methane or a mixture of gases that may come from a dairy farm or from a landfill. And those gases may have impurities, may have other gases, not methane, mixed in, but it's still from a biogenic source. It's a biogas. You can then upgrade that biogas to renewable natural gas. And AGA's definition for renewable gas is that that gas is compatible with the existing pipeline system, which means it has to meet gas quality specifications in order to be injected into the system. So that's quite simply the differentiation there. You got kind of raw biogas versus treated or upgraded renewable natural gas.
Do we see any biogas being used in the marketplace by consumers today, or is it all being converted into renewable natural gas? Can you share us who's using the biogas? Is it in industry or residential, or?
It is being used, so in some cases directly on site, where you may hook up an electric generator to use those gases and use it directly. You don't have the quality, the gas quality issues to address necessarily if you were to, say, inject it into the pipeline system. But we are seeing increasing amounts of investment into the renewable natural gas space, utilities, private developers, really a burgeoning industry to meet what has been significant growing demand for renewable natural gas. This is in the transportation sector out in California, but increasingly for other sectors across the country. And it's a real growing market, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars invested, and we're going to continue to see significant growth in that sector.
So both of you talk about, in addition to the environmental purposes of seeing electrification or changing how energy is delivered to the built environment, cost is another one. Tim Michaels has suggested that there's recent projections that natural costs may surge due to market adjustments, new LNG plants exporting, the economic impact in general, low costs currently driving certain developers out of it. He suggests that estimates maybe $8 per million BTU, I believe, by next winter. And that he was, in his experience, market forces will always work to balance out markets over time. And all of that information into the question of what are AGA's stated goals for enhanced equipment efficiency for items like the natural gas heat pump. So I guess there's two questions there. One, what are your thoughts on the costs going forward? And then two is your goals regarding enhanced equipment efficiency.
On the cost, there are two pieces that you need to evaluate. They're not independent from each other, but they can be segmented. One is the resource potential. And there, we can look to groups like the Potential Gas Committee operating out of Colorado in your backyard, Mike. And they look to record amounts of, or they've examined the technical potential for natural gas resources in the US and have identified a record amount of resource potential in terms of shale gas and other gas resources in the US, the highest in their 54-year history when they released their estimates last year. So there's significant resources that can be produced at low cost. But you have to have the infrastructure to move it. And that infrastructure has to, move it from the supply center to demand areas. And insofar that policy and other issues stand in the way of building new infrastructure, that can lead to some cost adjustments or cost impacts. Does that dynamic obviate or eliminate the cost benefits of gas relative to other fuel sources? I don't see that happening anytime in the near future. You asked Josh about LNG exports. That has been a source of concern for a decade when the issue of LNG exports first entered the public discussion. Today, or actually I haven't looked at the numbers today, but within the last week, we have record levels of exports in terms of daily demand, feed gas out of these export facilities. And the price of gas remains historically very low, very stable in terms of pricing, very affordable for customers. So I'm not sure I see the cause for concern in the near term here, but we still need to be able to build infrastructure to move gas where it's produced to demand centers. On the gas heat pump front, the natural gas industry, quite simply, is committed to advancing technologies like gas heat pumps and making sure that we can integrate them into, or make them available and commercialize them for consumers. We can go into more if you'd like, but the gas industry is committed on the demand side as well.
Okay. Mike, anything you want to add?
Yeah, please. Thank you. I mean, I won't try to forecast the price of gas, which is, inherently uncertain, but it is true when we think about costs, there's maybe, I'll offer my two ways to think about it. One would be to compare natural gas with electrification, which we've heard a bit about already. The other would be to compare an RNG pathway to electrification. And, on the first point of just comparing the natural gas we have today to an all-electric opportunity, we do have options. There are low-hanging fruit that are that offers savings opportunities today. It's mostly in new construction, and especially in milder climates like where we're seeing these things pop up in California, but in many other places as well. And then when we think about comparing RNG to electrification, that may be a more apt comparison because those are both solutions that would in some way reduce emissions. And so we have to recognize, if we just compare natural gas to a heat pump transition, that natural gas is a fossil fuel that drives climate change, and heat pumps are an opportunity to move away from that. And we see higher, the costs we see today are quite high on the RNG side, and there may be opportunities to bring those down in the future, but it's still a limited resource that can maybe meet 5% or 10%. I think at the high end of the American Gas Foundation study, it was between 10 and 15% of today's US gas supply could be met with RNG by 2040. And it's just not a solution at scale that can address the entirety of this problem. And that's a big element of why we want to see these types of policies that develop the market for new electric technologies.
So Missouri has a couple of interesting and exciting RNG facilities in play. The Midwest, with its animal agriculture, has a huge opportunity to impact that. I would imagine that not a silver bullet, but a silver buckshot, as Jim Fisher liked to say, is really the way to go. And we got to find a variety of different solutions. to get things done, and that will be cost and technology dependent, absolutely. When you reference there, Mike, the emission part, are those emissions just on the residential side and the gas, or because electrification, there's been a large shift from coal to natural gas as well. Are your CO2 reduced numbers including that transition, or is that something different?
Yeah, I think you're asking about the emissions on the electric generation side if we move towards all electric buildings. Yeah, I mean, what we see is that, as I mentioned before, the electric sector really is the only sector in our economy that's making making significant progress on reducing its emissions in this country. And we anticipate, we have every reason to believe that that progress will continue, and it will continue rapidly. Coal power is declining steeply in this country, and it's being replaced by a mix of gas and renewable technologies. And that mix over time the balance of that mix has shifted more and more towards renewables, and the growth of 100% clean energy policies has spread around the country. And now we're even hearing it proposed by President-elect Biden. So we have every reason to believe that the US electricity system is transitioning toward a very low carbon future. And it's already past the point. If you look at, how clean it is on average across the country, it's already past that point where we're confident that it's beating break even, so that a heat pump is going to be lower emissions than gas on average. And there are a few exceptions in the dirtiest parts of the country, but the large majority of the continental US, we believe a heat pump installed today, even considering those electric emissions, is going to produce lower emissions over its lifetime than a comparable gas furnace or boiler.
Josh, can I just add a couple thoughts to that?
Absolutely.
One, the progress that we've seen on the electric power sector is due to natural gas, and natural gas has led the reductions in emissions, according to EIA and others. Now, there's a combination here: increased renewable electricity, coal to gas switching, energy efficiency as well have all played a role, but gas has led the way. Things will change in the future; they always do. But let's be clear that there's still a robust opportunity for gas to continue to reduce emissions in all sectors, including power generation. Let me go back to something Mike said. He framed this as an issue of electrification versus renewable gas, and I think that's the wrong way to think about this here. I think we need to be, if we're serious about addressing this challenge of climate change, we need to be thinking about all the tools in our toolbox here. And I think, RMI has talked about managing the transition for gas utilities, getting off the gas system. And if we're serious about addressing the challenge of climate change, that's the wrong starting point here. We need to be thinking about leveraging all of our opportunities. And I want to be clear, I'm not against heat pumps, efficient heat pumps. I'm against forcing customers to use them. And that's the key distinction here when we're talking about these gas bans and these forced electrification policies. So some important lines we need to draw here in terms of what it is we're talking about, and what is it that we're really trying to solve. And what we're trying to solve is greenhouse gas emissions, presumably, but also maintaining affordability for energy and reliability and resilience of the energy system. These are all important objectives that we need to balance here.
Yeah,
and I appreciate you bringing it back to the ban. I know that we had some questions, and that was kind of part of the structure of this thing, is we had heard about the ban in California, and it really struck up some conversations locally. So we've been driving with the questions from the audience. So I know Mike and Richard, we haven't stuck with what we've talked about initially. So I appreciate your flexibility. On that last point, though, both according to and associated with the bans, and I think you both mentioned this, when you look at affordable housing, multifamily, a lot of those are older buildings. And Mike, you had mentioned the cost of retrofitting the house that you were looking at. Can each of you, when we look at this policy for new buildings, that's one thing. how do we address this particular issue of, building efficiency, whether it's through electrification or natural gas, with the consideration of, environmental justice, considering the low income and just the cost? What is that cost? Is it even feasible? And are we looking for those buildings to age out, which is, a lot longer than a traditional, car or, gas plant? You're looking at 80 to 120 years for a building. So any thoughts on that? Mike, you're unmuted, so I'll let you start.
Yeah, great. So you're asking about existing buildings as well, and we do think that those need to transition also, and that there's an argument to be made that policies and programs should prioritize and put first the needs of or the opportunity for disadvantaged communities that have been underinvested, lower income customers, to participate in this transition at the beginning and not to be an afterthought. We need to recognize that these, there are people who can afford to, buy new stuff for their house and people who can't. And the people who can't, may need help through new programs and policies that help them make that transition, and not be left behind and not be the last ones stuck on a system, which we do think the system, the utility gas infrastructure system, will need to transition, and we don't want to leave. It takes intentional policy to be careful about who goes first and then who's stuck with it later. No, I don't think the approach is for like buildings to age out. That's much too slow to just put in place a new construction policy and wait for the entire building stock to turn over. So what we need to see is further market development for these new products, the heat pump water heaters, et cetera, that in many parts of the country, the markets are not well developed. It's difficult as a consumer to call a contractor and say, I want to do this in my house. You'll often, people have stories, including myself, of the contractor is more reluctant than the customer, and that this is not going to go forward at scale until we develop that marketplace a bit more and help bring those prices down so they're in reach for more customers to electrify their own homes or affordable multifamily housing buildings or office buildings or whatever it needs to be. I think the key for me is that, if the alternative is just the status quo, the alternative can't be the status quo of just burning, 8 trillion cubic feet of gas every year in this country in our building sector, because, then we're stuck with the contribution to worsening climate change. Then we are stuck with the contributions to local air pollution and the human health hazards associated with that. And we're going to need a careful transition. And then just one comment on the idea of, the buckshot approach or all tools in the toolkit. I do think that when we think about like combining electrification and RNG or biogas, we get something that looks like that Colorado chart I shared in my slides, which is that the range that we're talking about of the potential of RNG is in, 5%. It's something. It's not nothing, but it's not the major contributor to the solution, just because the resource that we can develop for that is not there at scale. It doesn't address some of the other, methane leakage or health issues that we're concerned about. So that's why we believe it's principally a reducing gas demand through electrification as the primary solution.
So I guess I have a rhetorical question and then a point on the RNG statement just made. One, who pays for this? And we agree that vulnerable households, those facing energy burden, must be accounted for in these policies, and that's why we're concerned about these policies, because to date, the policies being proposed are going to hurt those vulnerable populations first and mostly. affordable energy saves lives. We can look to the National Bureau of Economic Research, and they did a study that showed how shale gas and the reduction in gas prices relative to electricity saves 11,000 lives a year, because those lower energy costs mean those people don't have to make trade-offs between food and medicine and their energy. I mean, 1/3, this is back in 2015, 1/3 of households in the US face some sort of energy burden. That's probably higher today given the pandemic and the economic situation we're in. So this has got to be front of mind here, this affordability issue, and who pays for it, and what happens when you get this, this different technology in a house, and how much more are you paying for that versus what you would have if you would have had an efficient gas solution instead. So, real key things to think about. On the RNG front, and whether it's, thinking about the future of RNG, whether it's 5% or 10% of future demand, and efficiency and driving down demand, what that means, we have to recognize that the US gas system, in particular the distribution system today, serves more than 30 million more customers today than it did in 1970 with the same amount of gas. To put that in a different way, the carbon dioxide emissions on average from the residential gas customer have been cut in half since 1970 because of energy efficiency improvements, tighter building envelopes, better appliances. We got to continue this progress, and this idea that I think there's a tension between these ideas that we need to get off the gas system, but we're still going to use this gas system for 5% of RNG. I'm not sure I understand the argument here. We need to use and leverage this system, and we're going to think creatively about how we use it, not just the status quo today, but how it will be used differently in the future. But you have to have that gas system, and you have to be able to make investments in it today in order to have those options available to us, for society, as well as customers in the future. So just a few extra thoughts to add there.
Josh, if I may get a word in, I think that it's important to note that if we use the same amount of gas today than we did in 1970, then that to me is not progress, because being the same place we were 50 years ago is not going to get us to a climate safe future at all. And then the second point, just to expand on, a small amount of RNG in the whole system. Yeah, the economics are not like great if you have 5% of the throughput and maintain the whole system. And so what we advocate for is starting to prune back that system, or at least as a first step, stop expanding it, because we know that the throughput on that system needs to go way down, and we want the fixed cost of the system to go down along with it. So as a first step is stop building it out to new houses and new neighborhoods and new buildings, which is exactly what these policies are doing, and then seek opportunities to prune that back and actually decommission whole portions of that system, so that what you need in the future is much, much smaller than what you have today.
The building sector has made great strides. When you look at only gas and ignore the switch from fuel oil to gas, the improvements in efficiency, you're ignoring significant emissions reductions in the direct use of fuels in the building sector, and that's ignoring all the progress made on the electric side as well.
So on this particular topic, part of it also comes down to the impacts of storms and the resiliency. Can both of you talk about the impact of electrification or gas bans, however you want to phrase it in your mind, but ultimately, what is the impact of storms on distribution and resiliency for owners if gas is not in play in the residential side?
Sure, I'm happy to go first. I think it's important to understand what the system we have today does and doesn't do, and what the system in the future will do. Most gas furnaces, gas boilers that heat through radiators or some sort of radiant heat, those systems do require electricity to operate. And if a storm knocks out electricity, then people are often without heat today. Now they may have some options to use a generator or use something else if they're experiencing this frequently, or maybe they have a wood stove or something else that's their backup source. So those, some of that impact is going to be the same either way, whether your heating system is electric or gas. we do need a more resilient distribution system in general. We hope to see, continued development of new technologies like microgrids and local generation and storage contribute to a more reliable and resilient electricity system overall, which can help with this problem. We also want to see, new buildings have a much smaller heating demand on cold days. Buildings that use ground source heat pumps or other technologies like that have a much smaller electric need. And so you get into a space where you're more capable of, whether it is people relying on that generator for backup or relying on the fact that they have a very efficient house that can ride through a several hours outage or something similar. But let's, I think we should be clear that today for most households, if the power goes out, their heat goes out already, and it's not a change from where it is today.
Thanks, Mike. Richard?
Yeah, Josh, I just differentiate a couple ideas here. One is between reliability and resilience. The reliability of the gas system is well studied, well understood. Right now, the gas system in terms of unplanned outages affect customers about, or 1 in 800 customers per year. By comparison, the electric distribution system has an average of 1 outage per year per customer. So there are significant reliability advantages to the gas system, which is precisely why in places like California, you see these carve-outs within these gas ban policies to continue to allow gas to be hooked up as a backup fuel source for on-site electricity generation and so forth, which is very important in that state, given the disruptions to service that we've seen in recent history. Differentiating between reliability and resilience, you got to talked about storms and the impacts of these low frequency but high impact events. And here the gas system provides significant resilience benefits. And I think that this is a critically unstudied issue when it comes to the impacts of forced electrification policies and other issues as we think through the future energy system, what that looks like, how do we maintain the resilience of our overall energy system, and how does gas and importantly gas infrastructure help support those objectives? So we've actually been thinking about this quite a bit, and maybe we can come back sometime soon and talk more about this topic with you.
I'd appreciate that. That'd be great. We are at 1 o'clock, so I am gonna have us in this session. I would say it was very lively and engaged, and I appreciate Mike and Richard your interest and your ability in engaging this topic in a diverse way. So knowing that it's not just your side sometimes, that's harder. So I appreciate that and acknowledge that. Thank you. As have several of the participants today. So with that, I do want to make sure everyone's aware. We have the second part of our series tomorrow, which includes